Welcome to Brave Dynamics. This is your host, Jeremy Au. Leadership is harder than it looks. As a proven founder and Harvard MBA, I interview courageous entrepreneurs, executives, and investors every week. I also share my frontline experiences, coaching insights, and own professional development journey. If you're stepping up as a new leader, founding a startup, or venturing into the great unknown, this is the podcast for you.
Sudhir Thomas Vadaketh is the author of Floating on a Malayan Breeze, Travels in Malaysia and Singapore, and co-author of Hard Choices, Challenging the Singapore Consensus. He's currently working on a book about China and India. From 2006 to 2013, Sudhir worked for the Economist Corporate Network and Economist Insights, both units of the Economist Group, in Hong Kong and Singapore. He continues to work freelance for the company. He has moderated and spoken on panels across Asia for the firm, most recently at The Economist's Open Future Festival in October 2019 in Hong Kong. In his personal capacity as an author, Sudhir has spoken at numerous institutions and events around the world, including Columbia University, Harvard University, the World Bank, Yale-NUS, the Georgetown Literary Festival, and the Singapore Writers' Festival. He is currently a contract-based supervising editor at DBS's Asian Insights office, as well as a senior writer at Incorporated Southeast Asia and Wildtype Media. Sudhir has written for a variety of publications, including The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Nikkei Asian Review, and The Straits Times. He has appeared on numerous regional and international video shows, including CNN's Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown. Born and schooled in Singapore, Sudhir has bachelor's degrees from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's degree from the Harvard Kennedy School.
Hey, Sudhir, good to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy. Nice to be here.
Well, we've actually had some similar journeys. We both came from local schools, then we both went to what was then known as Raffles Junior College, now Raffles Institution. We both went to UC Berkeley, and then after we both went to Harvard for our masters. You just happen to have like a lot more experience and a lot more leadership in these domains than I do now.
I'm not sure about more experience, but I certainly literally have more white hair all over my face and my head. But yeah, it's interesting that we followed a similar path actually. It was interesting when I left Singapore after Army in 1999. So I went to Berkeley after Army. And I just had one dream, right? I wanted to get my business degree in 3 years and then become an investment banker after that. That was my sole materialistic sort of money-minded dream. And of course, Berkeley happened to me, as I guess it does to many people. So, I remember a few of my introductory classes, anthropology, geography, which really just kind of opened my mind up to a lot of other issues around the world. And that kind of slowly moved me towards where I am today, interest in writing, interest in social justice, interest in political issues, interest in a lot of other things aside from Wall Street.
Yeah, definitely. I share the same sentiment. I remember out of NS, I went to UC Berkeley and I started growing out my hair to almost shoulder length, and I was wearing a lot of tie-dye.
Oh, really?
On the campus. So Berkeley got to me.
I'd love to see those photographs one day.
Yeah, definitely. And I was thinking to myself, this is the last time I got to get long hair and wear tie-dye. Otherwise, I'm going to, go back into corporate or whatever it is. Especially after so much time in NS, right? Where you're wearing like a buzz cut. So you're just going overshoot to the other end a little bit.
Yeah. I bleached my hair the first time I went for Burning Man. I mean, that's about as daring as I got with my hair and my fashion. But yeah.
I'm glad we're going to reminisce about Berkeley days nonstop. So I think before everyone already tunes up, because we're just like talking about all the fun times and, People's Park and everything, time on campus. I'm sure we're going to go into that as well later on. I'd love for those who don't know you yet, for you to share in your own words, your own leadership and professional journey.
Yeah. So I think what I wanted to do is talk about it in terms of two strands. One is my journey towards being an independent writer and commentator in Singapore. There aren't too many of us around, but we're slowly growing in size. And the other strand I wanted to talk about is how I've managed to, certainly not there yet, it's still an ongoing experiment, but how I've attempted to combine different mediums in my storytelling craft. I started off trained in the written word, but over the past 15 years, I've kind of incorporated more photography, incorporated more social media storytelling, and recently also I've moved into videos. That's the other bit of my journey that I probably want to talk about, how I managed to combine those different mediums. And I think a good place to start would be 2005, when I moved back from the States to Singapore. So, like you said, I did 4 years in Berkeley, then I did 2 years at Harvard, finished, graduated in 2005, moved back to Singapore, was looking around for a job, and very, very lucky. I think luck is such an important part of any journey. But I was very lucky to get a job at the Economist Group at a unit called Economist Corporate Network, which is a sister unit of the magazine. And so I joined them in 2006. I worked for them for 7 years, first at Economist Corporate Network and then at Economist Insights. Corporate Network does a lot of senior level advisory service for companies, and Economist Insights does sponsored research, so white papers for big companies. So I worked for those two units for 7 years in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And I say I was lucky because, it was just such a rewarding, transformative, fulfilling experience in every way imaginable. As anybody who reads The Economist or follows products from the Economist Intelligence Unit and other bits of the company might know, it was so rewarding. And there are a few things that I'd like to touch on, So I joined them in 2006. And I think one of the big things was that there were two big shifts going on. So one of them was this sort of shift of corporate intellectual interest towards Asia, right? Every other week, we had a new company wanting to invest a whole bunch of money, intellectual interest. There's just so much interest in the China story and shortly after that, the India story as well. And it was great to be in a position at the Economist Group where I was, kind of had a ringside seat to all of that, right? A lot of my work was at the interface of business and government and society, writing for the company, making presentations on regional economic outlooks, things like that. A very interesting time to be there. The other big shift that I think was very important is that it was a very turbulent time for media in general, right? It was the whole digital revolution. Business models were being upended. There was a huge shift of advertising revenue from print to digital. There was the rise of native advertising, sponsored research. That whole industry was changing. There was also a big shift in terms of content. That was the period when people were saying, let's forget the 50-page PDF. Nobody wants to read that anymore, right? People now, they have new devices, they have apps, switching to video, switching to social media, more infographics. How can we reframe our content to tell a different story to a new kind of consumer that doesn't necessarily want that long, sometimes dry paper that we used to produce. So I think being there again during that shift was great for me in terms of my understanding and knowledge of the media industry and all the changes and I lived through, but also that allowed me to think about how to adapt myself to changes that I'm still living through today and changes that will probably be with us for the next 10 or 15 years. Attention spans are also getting shorter. I think that's one of the big things that came along with that. That's also affected the way I think about content. The third thing about The Economist that I want to mention is amazing colleagues and mentors. Some of my best friends I made then, they're still people who I'm in touch with every day. And I think that's such an important part of personal growth and development and everything else. They gave me opportunities very early on in life. I still remember the very first time they put me up on stage in 2007. It was this big sort of gala, regional economic outlook type events. And, there were like these three older white guys and me. And it was nice that they trusted me enough to put me in front of a lot of very senior people and, share the Economist Intelligence Unit perspective on Asia. The night before, they very nicely invited me out to join them for beers, and I was like, no. I've got to practice my presentation, and they still give me a lot of shit for that about the nerves that I had the night before. But anyway, it was great. I had amazing bosses who were willing to give me all these opportunities very early on in my career, and they were incredibly disciplined about writing, right? So, I remember my boss like correcting little bits of grammar in my emails, just in my personal emails to him, right? It's not even content that's going out to anybody else, but I think that really inculcated this kind of writing discipline in me from a very early part of my career. couple of last things. I think the other thing that I really appreciated is the opportunity to write across mediums. I wrote for the magazine. Most of the world calls the magazine what we call the newspaper, probably the most popular product. I freelanced for them, but I also wrote mostly for two other units. And I think the difference there is that the newspaper or magazine, it's a sort of a free product. So you're writing for the layman or layperson, whereas a lot of the other products are B2B products. So you're writing for a business audience. And I think that kind of allowed me to develop talent and flexibility in terms of my writing skills, right? And knowing how to adjust and change the tone and style and things like that, depending on your audience, which is probably the most important skill for any writer or commentator, right? Knowing your audience and tailoring your message for the audience. And I got a chance to do that very often, very early in my career. And finally, last point before I stop this long monologue, but I was very lucky also because at the end of the day, having the Economist Group on my CV has just opened so many doors. I built a great network there. I still get work from people who I met during my 7 years at the Economist Group. And even today, when people see it on my CV, it's just, adds a bit of credibility to my name and helps me do whatever I want to do. So I was very fortunate to have that early on in my career.
Yeah, Sudhir, I mean, The Economist is something that everybody in the business world seems to be reading and would definitely recognize. I mean, I was in economics and business and undergrad, and that's when I started really reading The Economist more thoroughly. I mean, I think even in JC, junior college, they were giving us The Economist articles to read as part of the general paper practice and stuff like that. So I've been reading it for a long time, and it's interesting because as you keep reading it over and over, you kind of get a sense of not just I think the sophistication, obviously, of the thinking, but also you get a much better sense also of, I think, the values that he has, for better or for worse, depending on you agree or disagree. And then lastly, also, you get to see how much it percolates into the current way the business world talks about itself, right? I mean, I recently was on a panel with some folks, and obviously the guest was just commenting about the state of some stuff in the region, and I was just watching a panelist say stuff that was like, and after a while, I just clicked, and I was like, "Wait, you're paraphrasing the Economist," and then I know what you're talking about. But it's also good because I also read Economist, so I already have my own reactions to what you're saying. So now I can sound very sophisticated talking about it and reacting. I disagree with Economist on some parts, but I also agree with other parts. And it's so funny where it's like kind of like I feel like it's the one publication that the entire business world reads together, right? It's like the weekly book club that the entire business world has, right? My mother-in-law reads it, my wife reads it, my father-in-law reads it, my dad reads it, I read it. So it's like one of those things that and then obviously we talk about it all the time, right? So it's funny to see how The Economist really kind of like is an invisible hand to the discourse.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. We got a joke inside the company and outside as well that it comes out on a Friday, so it allows everybody who reads it to look and act and think smart over the weekend, right? During their cocktail sessions with their friends. But I am similar to you in my journey with the publication. I started reading it at A level, so that's pre-university, and that got sort of assigned to us every week, And one of the things that I really appreciated was my econs lecturer telling us, just read whatever you want. There's no fixed formula to any of this stuff. So, I and there are a lot of people within the company that I know who actually prefer the second half of the magazine. I started reading it from the back. The obituary is my favorite page. I love the science and technology. I love the books and art section. Even though I can't read, like I guess everybody who's listening, I can't read even 5% of all the books I want to read. I feel a great sense of accomplishment if at least I've read the book review on The Economist. I kind of feel I've read the book. I could go on for an hour, but the other thing that's very interesting is the narrative structure of the argument. So we used to joke in grad school that you kind of know an Economist reader because, there's a almost formulaic way of addressing a topic, right? It's like, this is why you should vote for Biden. This is why you shouldn't vote for Biden. But this is why we really think you should vote for Biden. So, it's almost every opinion piece or commentary kind of has that little bit of a structure in place. And I think there are a lot of lessons as a writer or commentator or analyst that you can draw from that. I think in my experience working with different younger writers, the ability to formulate a counter argument is very, very important. A counter thesis or counter argument. And I think The Economist does that very well in a very succinct way. And not everybody does it in their writing. So I think, yeah, just one of the many things I think that people can learn from reading the magazine.
Yeah, it's interesting that The Economist has become that touchstone from a literary and publishing perspective, as well as a business perspective. I still remember someone tweeted that in their interview, they asked someone what their life goal was. And their life goal was to be on the obituary for The Economist. And then everyone was like, wow, solid. That's a solid goal. Like, respect, And I'm going to say it's one of my favorite pieces as well. So I often flip to that page first if I can't read everything. So I'm kind of curious, before we talk about the ending of life, and the journey, let's talk about the beginning a little bit, right? So, I mean, obviously, got started at Economist, and then since then you've become a strong independent journalist. So how did that beginning of that journey look like to you?
Yeah, so in 2012, while I was still at the company, I published my first book, which is called Floating on a Malayan Breeze. So it's a book on Malaysia and Singapore, part travelogue, part social commentary. Published it in 2012, kind of moderate commercial reception, but there was pretty good critical feedback from my mentors, importantly, who read the book, and people around me who are interested in the topic, Singapore and Malaysia. So I got a lot of like little bits of encouragement from people like that to say, hey, you might have a future as a book writer, which is always, I guess, a bit of nervousness that comes with the first book. Is it just going to be a one-off, or is it actually going to be the start of a long journey? And so I was very encouraged by my mentors within the company telling me that they liked the book. And, the other thing that they told me, and they've been telling me this for a while, was that it's a wonderful place to be. You spend your entire career here. These are people who've probably been with the company, some of them 20 plus years. But, they were like, just be aware of one downside, a couple of downsides, many positives, but be aware of this one downside that you over time you will be indoctrinated in a particular form of writing. Now, it's a beautiful form of writing. It's the Economist style, or if it's at the EIU, the EIU style. But doing this for 20 or 25 years essentially almost kind of locks you in as an artist, right? Because you're just so indoctrinated in that style of writing. I've always had sort of dreams to push myself artistically in different ways. So far, I've been focusing on nonfiction. At some point, I'd love to do fiction, but even within the nonfiction realm, right? There's so many ways you can approach nonfiction, gonzo journalism, more literary forms of journalism, so on and so forth, which I realize I may not necessarily get a chance to do if I stayed at the same company. So that's kind of what sort of like pushed me to like think about doing something else. Yeah. So in 2013, I decided, which is a year after I published my book, I decided to just, I decided I built up enough of a network. I got enough experience for that part of my career. And so I decided to leave, try things on my own. And I was very nervous. So what was that journey like? I think extremely nervous. And one of the things you don't process enough, but kind of you're faced with the stark reality when it happens, is that I had gotten so used to having these powerful, big brand names behind me, right? And this goes back 13 years. 4 years I was at Berkeley, 2 years I was at Harvard, then 7 years I was at the Economist Group. During that time, no matter who I wanted to speak to, I could just email them. And if they see like, Sudhir at the Economist, or people would respond to me, right? At the very least, they'd reply to my email or pick up my phone call. But 2013, suddenly I was out on my own, right? I was just Sudhir at gmail.com. I didn't have those big brand name crutches anymore, and I think I had self-confidence, but you still, when you're faced with that reality, and when you're faced with then having to go to a situation where, as a writer, people stop replying to your emails. People ask you, who are you? And then, I go to spend 5 minutes going through my CV with everybody, which I didn't have to do before because, the Economist name opens any door. That was a very slightly nerve-wracking but interesting part of the journey for me, which thankfully over time I got used to it. And also I think, I realized that people you talk to are actually a lot more receptive of people, even outside of whatever big brand name they might be associated with. So I think that was a bit of my journey that I had to get used to. The other bit of it, which was also very nerve-wracking, was that there were a lot of naysayers, right? If you think about it, that was my first job out of university. I'd been there for 7 years. People were like, oh, how can you leave this great, hallowed, wonderful company? Every writer dreams of being at the Economist Group, and you only publish one book. You think you've made it already? What the heck are you doing? So there were a lot of naysayers, actually. It's funny now looking back, but all the aunties and uncles, and I think this is all, once again with our sort of like strict predetermined career paths that we deal with in Asia. But I think people see that shift, or saw that shift certainly in 2013, saw that shift from stable, secure job with a big company suddenly moving out. I think in today's world, it's getting easier with the gig economy, and freelance or contract worker or independent worker isn't such a bad word anymore for some people, but certainly difficult. That was the other difficulty I had at that point in time. But I was also so energized. So I think it wasn't just nerves. I think this is an interesting thing about any journey. At the same time, there's this sense of excitement about doing something new, particularly with storytelling, right? So exactly what my mentors had told me. Now I was faced with this completely blank canvas to think about storytelling, right? How did I want to maybe move away from that economist style that I had kind of developed to writing in a different form, thinking about storytelling in different ways. And I think that was very exciting. It was also very exciting to think that I was now going to start working with all sorts of different people, right? Different editors, different teams, video producers, artists, creators, all the different people that have come together in my life over the past 7 years. So, I spent 8 months traveling across India and China for the book that I'm working on now. And I had a photographer following me. So just that interaction with the photographer is the kind of interaction I would have never gotten if I just stayed in a regular job. Those sorts of things really, I find very fulfilling, and are the kinds of things that you don't get to do if you're just stuck in a particular company. Since leaving the Economist Group, I've written on technology, I've written on science, I've written long form for publications like Foreign Affairs, I've written short form for newspapers like SCMP, the South China Morning Post. These are all professional experiences that I wouldn't have gotten if I just stayed with one company. So I think that's all part of my learning and development, and very exciting. So just to give you an example, right now, many different things that I'm thinking about in terms of my content. I just finished a long leadership series on Singapore's prospective next Prime Minister. I am working on a video about Oxley Road, which is the home of the late Lee Kuan Yew. So there's been a lot of disagreement about what to do with his house. And I'm working on a video about that, and thinking about ways to marry the video with my long form content. My editor from one of the science papers that I write for just asked me to look into a paper on agri-tech and alternative meat and the modern food industry. And then I've got my book project as well. So my book on China and India, a couple of other book projects. So, spitting all that out at you to give you a sense of the diversity of content that actually I kind of juggle these days, which is actually, for me, it's very exciting. I think you'll probably find some editors and publishers out there who hate dealing with somebody like me because I can never focus on one thing. But I think it's interesting because there's so much like cross-fertilization of ideas that kind of goes on, again, which is very different from being in a more structured environment. You don't have as much cross-fertilization of ideas from different pieces of content.
Oh, that's amazing. And I'm so excited for you because, you really crossed that bridge from just setting off on your own to now being able to fully explore the range of ideas and formats that you want to do, right? So that's amazing. I think you started touching on this a little bit, which was, one of the biggest challenges for you was really kind of like the naysayers, and, obviously also like setting off on your own. Would you say those are the hardest parts and obstacles you had to overcome, or were there other things that you would like to expound on?
Getting people used to alternative careers, I think that was a big part of it. Showing people that it's possible to be done, showing people that you can enjoy it and make a living out of it. I think that's very important. Obstacles, I'd say money is a never-ending obstacle. I think as a freelancer, it's not something that is ever far from your mind. And especially the last year, COVID has obviously led to a drop in my freelance income. But I think a lot of it is just also reframing the way you think about the good life, right? I brought down my expenses quite a lot. I drink cheaper beer. I kind of see, but it's also like reframing that struggle as part of the journey, right? I think that's a choice you make when you move from having a stable income with health benefits and all the rest of it to being freelance. And I think as long as you view that as part of the journey and part of the excitement and struggle, that's important. I think other obstacles, I think in Singapore, and I think this is true for any country that has had a long either party or establishment in power for a long time, I think not everybody is very supportive of independent commentators. So I think that certainly has been an obstacle that I've had to deal with. But at the same time, despite all the critics that might be out there, every day there are more and more supporters as well. So there's a lot of love, and I can't stress enough kind of the importance of fans, supporters, readers who keep telling me to keep putting out the alternative type of content that I have been putting out. And I think they are very important. I mean, a lot of them are my friends, but a lot more also people that I don't know about who write random messages of support. So I think for any independent commentator I think in any situation, not just Singapore, but any situation where you've got an established media and you've got a dominant voice in terms of public discourse, I think you're going to get some pushback from the dominant players, either in terms of financial leverage or also sometimes in terms of outright criticism and attempts to smear you. So I think, again, that's one thing I've had to deal with. But like I said, there are a lot of people behind me, so it just makes it easier.
Yeah, that's so true. One thing is, of course, there's a huge contrast between, Berkeley and the hallowed, free speech movement. And we've seen that to some extent as well at Harvard as well, which is very much an academic, independent thought, very kind of like scholarly dynamics on independence and academic freedoms. And of course, there's a world today, right? I mean, I think this argument that you're kind of hinting at is a conflict that's happening everywhere, right? In the US, in the EU, globally, which is, how do we handle, free speech on one hand, and on the other hand, of course, like the different permutations of factors that people are trying to accommodate and so on and so forth. So I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts about that at a high level?
Well, I don't think any society has gotten speech right. If you look at what's happened over the past 10 years if we just take places like Berkeley and Harvard, for example, certainly aspects of the shutting down of speech. I wouldn't just call it liberal intolerance of speech. I think that's something people talk about, but certainly there's an aspect of liberal intolerance of speech, which is part of it. The shutting down, the shouting down, the canceling of particular speakers who try to come to Berkeley, for example. I think these are all complications right now in the broader sphere, which I don't think anybody has really gotten right. And then you've got the issue of technology. So I think the natural conversation then is about how the impact of the Facebooks and Twitters of the world on speech. We could speak about different countries' approach to it. I think in Singapore, my sense is that still have a long way to go in terms of incentivizing ordinary people to voice their opinions. Despite all the pushback against Facebook, for example, and if you look, for example, at what's happened with Facebook in Myanmar over the past decade, suddenly you can point a lot of fingers, very damning fingers at Facebook's conduct in Myanmar and the way they've allowed hate speech to just spiral out of control and the impact that it's had on the Rohingyas and the conflict there. I often tell people that in the Singapore situation, actually, as far as I can see, Facebook has had a very powerful, liberalizing, democratizing sort of impact in terms of speech. It's given a platform to many people, including myself, who may not have had an opportunity to speak 20 years ago. It's allowed many different groups to form connections across society, may not have had the platform for that 20 years ago. Singapore, for those of your listeners who are not too familiar, we've always had a very strong mainstream media setup. Government control channels have usually, I'd say up till about mid-2000s, have been the dominant voices in society. Now, social media and the internet has changed that over the past 15, 20 years. So I think Facebook and other social media channels, I would say, have been a force for good in Singapore. But I'm very aware, hyper aware of the dangers of speech as we've seen play out in places like Myanmar. I think it's such a complicated conversation, which I don't see ending anytime soon. If I could just leave with one high level thought, I think it's, from what I've seen, it's not so much freedom of speech that we have to prioritize in a modern thinking society, but it's the freedom to hear from diverse viewpoints, which they don't always equate. Because freedom of speech, complete freedom of speech, can lead to the complete shutting down of particular vulnerable communities. If freedom of speech means I'm going to tell the persecuted Rohingyas to shut up, I'm going to tell the persecuted Rohingyas to get the hell out of here, that essentially means that I'm not going to hear from the persecuted Rohingyas. So I think at a high level, the more important philosophy for a society is that they have to find a way to ensure freedom for all voices to be heard. Those two are not always aligned to each other.
Wow, that was actually a really deep thought. I mean, I never heard of that. There's a really orthogonal take, which is, we always talk about growing up is like my parents would tell me, hey, it's important to speak, but it's also important to listen, right? And hear, right? And I think there's something very truthful here, which is I think a lot of it is being framed as, freedom of speech, but whether there's freedom to hear and listen, that's a very orthogonal, very different take,
No, especially in societies where you have such unequal access to information, unequal access to the means to speak. Why are the two of us here having a conversation, right? I mean, and why are people listening to me when I speak? I've obviously had many forms of privilege throughout my life. I spoke at length about the Economist Group, but I've had so many other forms of privilege throughout my life. But I think the best way forward is for us to ensure that all the different constituent groups have access for their voices to be heard. Most societies around the world are a long, long way from that. It's kind of a pipe dream, right? But, as with a lot of these things, that's the target we have to aim for. That's what we have to strive to achieve. It's a long way off, but that's what we have to strive to achieve.
It definitely resonates with me. And what I definitely agree with you is about there's an articulation of the consequences and how we manage it versus its longer or like more invisible effects, right? That really reminds me actually of like, I did some research back in the day for undergrad. And one of the things that I came across and was really struck by was through the arc of history, you've seen communication technologies, like you said, create the ability of speech, but also create the ability to hear and listen, right? And so obviously the printing press fueled revolutions, right? Printing pamphlets were instrumental for the creation of the newspaper or the pamphlet created tremendous social change and economic change across Europe and America. Yet today, none of us would say, let's delete newspapers, right? The radio also changed and created humongous amount of change at the societal and cultural and economic and, governance level. So did TV as well. So did cable. And so I think, I feel like to me, like society is still grappling and going through that conversation. Like I wondered to myself a little bit, are the conversations we're having about the internet today are the ones that people had around the printing press, right? Should we regulate the printing press versus, do we let everybody have it? And I think obviously, today it's somewhere in between, right? To some extent. So it's interesting to think about that from a historical arc as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is an argument to be made that it's just the generational medium of our time. But there also is an argument to be made that there is something fundamentally different. When you look at the concentration of financial and commercial and marketplace power that some of these companies have, I think there is something a little bit unprecedented with that. Potentially, the ability to potentially shape conversation. So, I haven't really fully formed my thoughts on this, but I do think there's an element of both. I think, like you said, it's somewhere in the middle. I do feel we're living through a long transitory period right now where, we're getting used to just conversing, right? At its most elemental form, humans are just getting used to a new way of conversing with each other. That's what it is. How long it's going to take and how government, technology firms, society, relationships are going to be changed. There's so many interesting, for me as an analyst, it's fascinating, right? To think about the Great Firewall in China, to think about separate evolution of technology in China versus outside, to, think about whether Biden or Elizabeth Warren type intervention is going to come in to break up tech companies. I think these are all like fascinating questions of our generation. for me, like taking a step back from all the carnage that's out there, it's actually like, it's so fascinating, right? I'm just following it with so much interest, and very conscious of the fact that I'm very much a user as well, a beneficiary as well. Every time I post something on Facebook. So yeah, it's an interesting time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting to see so many independent journalists like you take the advantage of these trends, right, to create their own personal brand, their own personal writing channel. I mean, I really love what you've done with sudhirtv.com. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what you write there, what you share there. And it's definitely been very interesting for many of my peers as well to read about what you're saying and to agree or to disagree, right, with what you're saying. And so it's interesting to see that dynamic happen. And the truth is, 20 years ago, I don't think anybody would have been even discovered you to agree or disagree with you, right? There would have been no sudhirtv.com to go and have that point of view or react to it, right? So I'm so curious about it. How do you feel about that for yourself and other independent journalists like yourself?
Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting question, right? I think if we didn't have the internet, a lot of us would either just have been doing something else, or we would have been just traditional journalists with the mainstream media, which would have necessarily meant that the diversity of views in Singapore would have been less, right? Because we would have been operating under particular constraints. Yeah. So, I started my blog, Sudhir TV, SUDHIRTV.com. It's actually my initial, Sudhir Thomas Vadaketh, but since I moved into video, it's actually formed a very convenient acronym, right? Sudhir TV. So thank you to my Indian parents for giving me this very long, archaic Indian name, which finally has some purpose. But I started the blog, I think, like 15 years ago, and at that time it was mostly the written word. It was very casual. I think I had just finished at Berkeley. It's since just sort of grown and evolved over the years, and more subscribers, more people supporting it. I now have a section where I post all my videos. I started doing videos more seriously about 15 months ago. I think the interesting thing is I've started experimenting more with combining the different mediums. So, having a long form piece, but also interspersing it with video and images and other bits of content, infographics sometimes. And yeah, it's kind of become like a bit of a digital magazine. Started off as a blog, and I think the best way to describe it now is a digital magazine. Sort of links to my books as well over there, to my Instagram page. It's kind of a fun thing, which also has a lot of serious content for people who want that kind of thing. It's allowed me to push myself. If I think about myself as a writer purely, it's allowed me to push myself in different ways, because I recently wrote an obituary on Maradona, somebody who I grew up with, who for about 1 month in 1986, I somehow thought I might one day be like him. But then the realities of growing up in Singapore versus Argentina hit home very hard. So I wrote a piece on him recently. I wrote a piece on long obituary on my experience of meeting Anthony Bourdain, after Bourdain died. I do a lot of writing on food as well. So yeah, it's just been this vehicle that's allowed me to push myself in different ways. And again, I just have much more time for this kind of creative pursuit ever since I left my job. So yeah, it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun doing the blog.
I think a lot of people in the tech industry are both, very proud about the ability to indirectly or directly support, like, journalists like yourself, as well as content creators that like so many of us, right? But they're also very ambivalent about their own role in the worst things that are being ascribed, right? So we talked about the violence that were amplified. We're talking about protests. We're talking about echo chambers. Talking about a great filter and all these different dynamics of technology and algorithms and so forth. So kind of curious, like, do you have any thoughts on people who want advice on how to think about their, moral obligations or their ethical dynamics they need to be thinking through as they work, day to day, as a junior member of a, tech company, or as a middle manager or as a senior executive? How would you think about that?
I guess I'll answer that with a focus on media and technology. I think the biggest danger, and I've seen it, I don't want to put any companies in the spotlight, but I've seen it several times now over the past 15 years in Singapore and in other countries, but in Singapore particularly, just because That's where I have the most experience. I think the biggest danger is with people who place too much of a premium on eyeballs and short-term exits. I think once you have that as your guiding mantras, right? And sometimes, sometimes it's not even a guiding mantra. It's something that the founder has at the back of his mind, and he doesn't want to talk about it, or she doesn't want to talk about it, and they kind of cover it up with all kinds of wonderful flowery messages about having a new media channel or creating content for this area of society that doesn't have content that addresses their needs. But actually, at one of their core impulses is, how can I drive up eyeballs? How can I drive up engagement? How can I position this company for an exit within 3, 5, 7, 9 years? Whatever it is, depending on the founder. And that really is, in today's media landscape, for me, it's such a dangerous way to think about it. Because, so if you go back to some of the things I talked about with the changes happening at the Economist Group and other traditional media companies, a lot of traditional media companies which have built up processes to deal with a lot of editorial issues, right? They are having so many financial pressures put on them. Now, the New York Times has done an amazing job of making the transition to the digital era. I'm not so sure about a lot of other companies out there. And so we basically have this almost a bit of a kind of a gap between these traditional stalwarts who have the right processes in place, but aren't yet fit for purpose for the digital age. And into this vacuum, into this gap, you're getting all these new players coming in, and a lot of them don't have the right processes, don't have the right editorial checks, don't have the right ways of building up trust with the reader or viewer, don't have the right ways of fact checking. Basic fact checking is not there. So, and they are incentivized so much, and we can have a longer discussion about the sort of trail of incentives, going all the way to venture capitalists as well, right? Who themselves fueling the entire industry. That's probably the biggest danger now. I hope that people entering the new media space or anywhere in that media technology space actually think about some of the core journalism values, right? These are values that have been with us for over a century now, that the Economist was started in the mid-19th century, mid-1800s. And so, a lot of the big traditional companies have very strong values. And you don't even have to look very much further afield. Even if you look at traditional values that newspapers like we have in Singapore have, papers like the Straits Times, I might disagree with them in terms of their political bias sometimes, but at the end of the day, they do have those proper core processes in place for most of their content. And I think it's important for anybody starting out to remember what those core values are, even though that might mean that you can't exit in 5 years or you can't exit in 7 years. I think media is a little bit different.
Amazing. Kind of wrapping things up here. Are there any common myths and misconceptions to being a content creator in this new digital age?
Well, I think one thing that I've had to deal with is, and this is kind of a challenge as well for me, is that being in front of the camera for the first time was extremely nerve-wracking, and it's still extremely nerve-wracking for me. That was probably one of the biggest challenges and transitions that I had to make, from being a writer who's very comfortable sitting by myself behind the safety and sanctuary of my screen, in front of the lights and the camera and everything. And I think the misconception there is that, so I've gotten used to it, to some degree, right? But, it still makes me nervous. My inner shirt is like completely wet with sweat every time I do a short segment. But the misconception there, people who watch me sometimes think that I'm actually enjoying myself and having a good time. It's actually quite painful. Kind of keep doing it for the bigger purpose. I think, what are some of the other misconceptions? I guess, that also has to do with that element of maybe celebrity or fame or whatever that comes along with it. So ever since I started doing video, and I'm still, it's just kind of small beer compared to all the big tubers around the world, right? But within the Singapore political scene, I guess I've got a bit of a following and people know me. So within that confine of that space, I think sometimes people have started kind of calling me out on the street and things like that. And I walk around Singapore. The joke that I tell my good friends is that it's been quite fortunate that with COVID, I've had to have my mask on, right? Most of the time, so people can't really spot me. and it's a difficult thing to talk about as well, because at the same time, nothing gives me as much joy as like meeting somebody who's been following my work or has been supporting me, and I know that they're kind of the reasons that I still have the energy to do these things. But I think then again, there's that myth and misconception, which I think is true for some quote unquote influencers, and I'd never call myself that they actually enjoy the limelight and the spotlight and everything else. But I think the reality for a lot of us, and I'm sure it's true for writers, and it'll be true for any writer who's moving to video, is that element of it is not something that really attracts me. It's not the reason we kind of do things to be recognized on the street, or to have some little bit of fame or whatever. So I think that's another myth or misconception. I think those are the two that kind of come off the top of my head.
Last question here is for those who are, considering a journey similar to yours, right? Either in terms of like journalism or, becoming a content creator online. What advice or resources would you recommend to them?
I think I'm going to answer this again in a slightly philosophical way, which would be to say that I think the most important thing is to expose yourself to every medium. I think in today's world, to be a content creator, you absolutely have to consume every possible medium. So unpack that a little bit. Like, I know people who don't watch much TV, and this is just not like older people like my dad, but I know younger people also who they don't watch much TV. They think that TV is a waste of time, and all the knowledge in the world is going to be gotten from books and academic papers or journals or whatever. But actually, in my opinion, some of the best commentary, some of the best language, some of the best ideas I've seen and heard in recent times have been from shows on Netflix and HBO. So I'll just give you two examples. Like The Crown, I love The Crown on Netflix. The use of language, thinking about empire, thinking about family relationships, thinking about monarchies and republicanism. I think there's so many things that I've gotten from The Crown. And if I could just quote another one, The Watchmen, a series on HBO. It's almost like the best thing that I've seen on race relations in the US, right? If you really think about some of the messages that are coming out of The Watchmen. So that's on the one side, people who I know don't watch TV. Then I also know people on the other side. This is, I guess, is a bit of a symptom of our short attention span. But I also know people who've like stopped reading books because they're just spending all their time on YouTube or Netflix or whatever it might be. And I think that's a big mistake as well, because a book is one of the few mediums that allows you this kind of like deep cerebral type thought into a subject. I don't think any other medium really allows you that. This totally applies as well to people who see themselves only as YouTubers. Even if you see yourself only as a YouTuber, don't stop reading books, please, because I think it just allows you to improve the quality of your language, the quality of your thought. And you don't realize this initially, but it kind of really came home to me during my transition to video, that it's so important to be able to take these, and this of course is something that The Economist trains you in as well. It's so important to be able to take these long, deep thoughts and ideas and really condense them to a very succinct message. And I was doing that for a long time in my writing, but video is a whole different ball game in that respect, and thinking about expressions and everything like that. And I think when you actually, so for people who like to do video, the reason I'll say still read books is because you need to have that really strong body of knowledge in particular subjects in order to be able to break it down. I don't think you can just like read a couple of articles, which is what a lot of the content creators today do, right? They read a couple of articles, they watch a couple of videos, and then they spit out something at you. And it's almost always like a victory of style over substance, right? It's flashy and it's nice, but when you listen to the words that they're saying, it's actually not the best way of presenting that bit of information on a topic. So that would be my singular piece of advice to a content creator, to a commentator, to a writer, whatever, is don't block yourself off from any particular medium. And it's actually one of the hardest things for us to do today. How do you design your media diet today, right? Between TV, podcast, book, it's terrible because it's a sort of paradox of choice, right? But I think it's a very important thing for anybody to do. Absolutely.
Amazing. Sudhir, thank you so much for sharing your journey and so much deep thinking for this episode. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to really appreciate you sharing all of it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's been fun, and I still want to see those tie-dye T-shirt photographs that you have.